By the late 1960s, the ZIL-130 had already become a symbol of the Soviet era. Simple, reliable, and truly people's. The Likhachov plant was at its peak. The best engineers, government support, and enormous resources. The future seemed secure. But the attempt to create a successor to the 130 became the beginning of the end. This is not just a story about an unsuccessful model. It turned out to be much more dramatic, filled with intrigue and even personal tragedy. In this video, I will tell why the project that was supposed to mark a new stage of success ultimately destroyed the country's main truck manufacturer. In the first part of the story, I talked about the life of the ZIL-130. If you haven't seen it yet, I recommend starting there to get the full context. I'll leave the link in the pinned comment and a pop-up in the top right corner. There's one thing that keeps repeating in the stories I tell on this channel. Like a red thread, it runs through the fate of almost every Soviet or Eastern Bloc car. In the 60s and 70s, they built solid, often impressive vehicles that could stand up to Western ones. But updates were delayed. While Western automakers kept moving forward, Soviet plants kept building outdated models. And when they finally tried to make a successor, the result was usually obsolete from day one. Add to that the economic collapse and the end of the USSR, and you have the same story again and again. At first glance, the story of the ZIL-130 and the whole ZIL plant seems to fit that pattern perfectly. In 1956, they released a truck that was modern for its time and became a real success, both at home and abroad. The 130 stayed in production almost unchanged until the mid-80s, when a successor finally appeared. But the new ZIL-4331 was already outdated. It used the same chassis and even the same engine as the old model. By then, Western trucks had already moved to cab-over layouts, while ZIL's new cabin had no room for future upgrades. The biggest issue was the engine. The old gasoline V8 from the 130 was extremely thirsty, around 35 liters per 100 kilometers on paper and up to 45 when loaded. For a mid-sized truck, that was way too much. But back in the 50s to 70s, the USSR simply didn't have a compact, reliable diesel. Diesels were seen as tractor or tank engines, heavy, slow, and hard to start in winter. Until the mid-1980s, the USSR had no real concept of a fuel crisis. When most of the world suffered during the 1973 oil shock, the Soviet Union actually profited from it. It was a major exporter of oil and refined products. Inside the country, gasoline was dirt cheap, almost like water. Fuel consumption wasn't really a concern for anyone, neither for the engineers nor for the operators. That's why the ZIL-130's V8 engine, burning about 40 liters per 100 kilometers, was considered perfectly acceptable. Besides, it turned out to be a great engine, reliable, simple, and with that smooth, deep sound many drivers still remember. By the mid-1980s, the USSR had finally learned what a fuel shortage really meant. Times were changing. The first signs of a market economy appeared, and a gasoline V8 under the hood of a medium-duty truck started to raise serious criticism. As a result, the new ZIL never fully replaced the old 130 on the production line. In fact, both models were built side by side until 1995. Meanwhile, the factory itself was slowly sinking into stagnation, completely unprepared for the new era. It might seem like the story ends there. Everything fits the logic of late Soviet times. But things weren't that simple. To truly understand how ZIL ended up here, we need to go back to the 1960s. At that time, cargo traffic across the country was steadily growing. After the ZIL-130 and 131 were developed and launched into production, the Design Bureau decided to focus on creating a new family of trucks with a payload of more than 8 tons. The 130 had a capacity of around 5 tons. Between 1963 and 1967, engineers developed and built in small numbers the ZIL-133 series, which was essentially a 3-axle version of the 130, using the same engine and components. The payload really increased, reaching about 8 to 10 tons. But the engineers soon realized that pushing the 130 design any further wouldn't give them what they needed, a true family of heavy-duty trucks. Its potential was limited. By the late 1960s, the advantages of cab-over layouts were becoming obvious around the world, and Soviet engineers took note of that as well. It also became clear that a heavy truck needed a diesel engine rather than a gasoline one. So, the 133 program was shut down, and in 1967, work began on a new project, the main hero of today's story. ZIL engineers already had some idea about cab-over layouts. Back in 1964, they built an experimental truck with that design. It never went into production, but the team gained a bit of experience. After studying the foreign trucks, the team liked the International 220 the most. Chief designer Anatoly Krieger had worked and trained in the US and had already dealt with international trucks while developing the ZIS-150, so the American approach felt closer than the European one. It was more inspiration than direct copying. Work in the design department was in full swing, and by May 1969, the first prototype of the ZIL-170 was ready for testing. At that stage, it still used a gasoline engine from the 130, a temporary solution. The production version was meant to get a V8 diesel developed by the Yaroslavl motor plant, with 210 horsepower. Since the engine came from outside, the ZIL engineers didn't have to design their own, which saved time and resources, and let them focus on improving the chassis and overall performance. By the end of 1969, the first lineup of the ZIL-170 was ready. 2 tractor units for 16 and 20-ton semi-trailers, a flatbed truck, and a dump truck. Many of you have probably already thought about it, and some may have even typed a comment saying, "Wait, this isn't a ZIL, it's a KamAZ. I've seen this truck. It's definitely a KamAZ." And you would be partly right. In 1969, the Soviet government issued a decree to build a new truck manufacturing complex in Tatarstan. According to that decision, all the design work for the new cab-over truck with a more comfortable cabin was transferred to the newly created KamAZ plant. ZIL was left with almost nothing, because all the key hopes and engineering efforts were focused on this project. The ZIL-170 was supposed to gradually replace the aging 130 and become the next big step for the factory. In the USSR, it was common practice to hand over vehicle designs from one plant to another. The Moskvich 444 went to Zaporozhye and became the ZAZ, and the GAZ-69 moved to Ulyanovsk, where it started the UAZ line. But in all those cases, the initiative came from the developers themselves. ZIL was the exception. The decision to give the project to KamAZ hit the team hard, but there was no way to oppose a government order. For the engineers, it felt like emptiness. What seemed like a simple redistribution of work actually became a turning point. From that moment, the slow decline of the ZIL plant began. By the early 70s, ZIL was left with the old 130 model and a long-frozen project of the 133. There wasn't much they could do. Engineers had to pull old blueprints out of dusty archives and try to make something out of them. Only in 1974 did they manage to start serial production of the ZIL-133 GYA. And, ironically, it used a diesel engine from KamAZ. The development of the 130's successor began in 1974 and dragged on for more than a decade. Only by 1985, production finally started with the ZIL-169, which by then was renamed ZIL-4331. The new truck didn't cause much excitement. Most people saw it not as a breakthrough model, but as a deep modernization of the old one, which it actually was. Despite all that, the state orders were still coming in. The main assembly line was running, though ZIL had already lost its status as the country's main truck maker. Then came a turning point, the collapse of the Soviet Union. For ZIL, it meant a government decree from June 1, 1992, on the privatization of the ZIL Production Association. The plant was turning into a joint stock company, and in practice, that only meant trouble. In the early 90s, the word privatization sounded like a death sentence for any factory. Back then, though, no one could believe that a giant employing over 100,000 people could simply vanish. But privatization was just one problem. Falling demand, the loss of military contracts, and the breakdown of the old Soviet supply network. All this pushed ZIL to the edge of survival. And yet, in 1996, a small miracle happened. The plant developed what became its last truly new model, the ZIL-5301 Bichok, a light 3-ton truck. It used a slightly updated cab from the older ZIL-4331 and a simple diesel engine from Minsk. The truck turned out to be cheap, easy to maintain, and just what the market needed. Buyers liked it. It looked like a comeback, a real chance to save the factory. But there was one problem no one could overcome. In 1916, when construction began on the car plant that would later be known as ZIL, it stood on the outskirts of Moscow. But the city kept growing, and by the 1990s, the factory found itself almost in the city center, on land worth a fortune. The plant's area was enormous too, around 300 hectares. Naturally, many people wanted a piece of it. The land's value was sky high, and the temptation was strong. Maybe that's why, or maybe for other reasons, the production of the new model was moved to ZIL's branch in the Saratov region. The main plant, once again, was left with almost nothing. From that point on, the story of the factory became a series of loud promises and real decline. Every year they said, "We're about to take off," yet it kept falling lower. To grasp the scale, just look at the production numbers. 95 cars per year, and that's at a factory that used to produce 200,000 annually. By that time, ZIL could no longer be saved by small projects, the kind that simply replaced the cab on the old 130 frame. Models like the ZIL-4329 with a Chinese cab and the same Minsk diesel engines couldn't change anything. A revival required something new, but there was nothing new left to build. By the 2010s, the plant's life had turned into a slow liquidation. Everything that could be sold, spare parts, vehicles, unused equipment, went under the hammer to cover wages and debts. The dealer network had collapsed, and buyers were few. Occasional city orders for utility and fire trucks were the only brief moments of relief. The assembly line stopped in 2013, when the last serial ZILs were built. After that, the decline became irreversible. But even after the line was shut down, ZIL workers kept assembling a few trucks by hand, using leftover parts and components. These final vehicles were built almost manually, on pure enthusiasm, without any conveyor, piece by piece. In 2016, they completed the very last truck with the ZIL badge, the hooded ZIL 43276T, a modernized version of the 43311, with a fiberglass front and a Minsk diesel engine. It was built in the press and frame shop, timed to the plant's 100th anniversary. But it wasn't a celebration. It felt more like a farewell. That shop was one of the few still standing, while the rest of the factory was already being demolished. It's hard to imagine what the workers felt, assembling the last ZIL by hand while bulldozers tore down the plant outside. And the final truck didn't go to a museum. It went to work, in the Kazan tram depot, where it might still be serving today. By 2025, the ZIL factory was gone, completely demolished. In its place now stand residential towers and shopping centers. Originally, the area was supposed to be called ZIL Peninsula, but in the end it was given another name, ZILART. As for KamAZ, things turned out very differently. The truck designed by ZIL's engineers proved so successful that KamAZ instantly became the leader of the Soviet trucking industry, and has remained one ever since. It's hard to overstate how fateful that decision was, to hand over the ZIL-170 project to KamAZ. Rewriting history makes no sense, but one thing is clear. Had ZIL kept its creation, the story might have ended very differently, and perhaps the Likachov plant wouldn't have become a symbol of an entire era's downfall.